During our trip, my stepson and I navigated moments of emotional complexity that neither of us had expected. This is a true story of infidelity that unfolded in unexpected ways. One never truly grasps the delicate nature of existence until a single fleeting moment sends everything spiraling out of control. What was intended as a straightforward family getaway, a serene escape to the mountains for a bit of reconnection, turned out to be quite the experience. David was adamant. He always placed great importance on appearances, striving to showcase us as a flawless, harmonious family. It was inconsequential that our union had evolved into a more transactional partnership than one steeped in romance, nor that Mason, his son from a previous marriage, had perpetually maintained a certain distance, never truly embracing me in the role of stepmother. I found myself agreeing to the trip, driven more by routine than by genuine enthusiasm. I chose to comply, to find common ground, and to maintain harmony. Yet tranquility eluded me that weekend. Be sure to subscribe to my channel, allowing me to share more captivating true stories such as this one. Be sure to watch this video all the way through and give it a thumbs up, as the story unfolding is bound to be utterly captivating. Kindly tap the like button to express your support. A seemingly innocuous error set everything in motion. A mix-up with the lodge reservations occurred. David had mistakenly booked the wrong dates for our rooms, resulting in one less than needed. He brushed it off nonchalantly, proposing that Mason and I occupy the same room. It was merely for a single night, he had remarked, dismissing it with a casual gesture that evening. In the soft glow of our shared room, as I lay beside Mason, a profound awareness washed over me. The delicate nature of the family bond we had painstakingly woven together. In retrospect, I find myself pondering whether it was truly inevitable, whether the unraveling was destined to occur, or if it was that singular night at the lodge that set everything in motion. The repercussions extended far beyond what I had ever envisioned. This tale unfolds the unraveling of it all. The journey to the lodge stretched on, enveloped in a profound stillness, a silence that arises when words have all but faded away. David navigated the road with unwavering concentration, while I occupied the passenger seat, my gaze lost in the world beyond the glass. Mason sat in the rear, headphones snugly in place, his gaze locked onto the screen of his phone. It was a sensation we knew well. Our family excursions had always carried this essence. Three individuals traversing their own paths, forever eluding genuine connection. "Have you packed the hiking boots?" David inquired, shattering the stillness. "Indeed," I responded in a monotone manner. He nodded, his gaze shifting back to the road ahead. Mason remained mostly silent throughout the drive, a tendency of his that was particularly pronounced in my presence. At 28, he possessed a quiet, intense demeanor that suggested he was perpetually concealing something beneath the surface. He possessed his mother's dark hair and striking features, perpetual echoes of the woman David had cherished prior to my arrival. I held no resentment toward Mason for it. His mother had passed away during his teenage years, creating a void that no one, not even David, could ever hope to fill. Yet, a chasm lingered between us. Neither of us had truly endeavored to close that gap. Upon our arrival at the lodge, the sun dipped below the horizon, enveloping the mountains in a warm, golden glow. The lodge exuded a quaint and rustic charm, evoking memories of cherished family vacations from days gone by. As David handled our check-in, Mason and I busied ourselves with unloading the car. "This place truly has a charm to it," Mason remarked while he maneuvered a suitcase over the gravel. "Indeed," I responded, taken aback that he was addressing me. He cast a fleeting look in my direction before redirecting his attention to the car. Within the lodge, warmth enveloped the space, its wooden panels and snug furnishings creating an inviting atmosphere. Yet, as David emerged from the front desk, the look on his face revealed an unsettling truth. "There's been a mix-up," he said, running his fingers through his hair in exasperation. "Only 2 rooms remain available for tonight. The third one shall not be prepared until the morrow." I gazed at him, understanding the implications of this moment. "What comes next?" "We'll find a solution," he stated with a sense of urgency. "I will reserve 1 room for myself, while you and Mason can share the other one." A knot twisted in my stomach, yet I chose to remain silent. David had already put the matter behind him, brushing it off as a mere inconvenience. The space that Mason and I inhabited was modest yet inviting, featuring a queen-sized bed and a soft lamp that bathed the quilt in a warm, gentle light. The fragrance of pine wafted gently through the open window. "This is cozy," Mason remarked, his voice steady as he placed his bag on the ground. I summoned a smile. "It is merely for a single night." Instantly, the awkwardness enveloped the room. I attempted to divert my attention by unpacking and organizing my belongings in the cramped bathroom, while Mason occupied himself with his phone as nightfall approached. The atmosphere in the room was charged with an almost palpable intensity. "You shall have the bed, Mason," I remarked, positioned by the window. "I am capable of resting on the floor." "Don't be absurd," I responded, a bemused shake of my head accompanying my words. "The bed is spacious enough to accommodate us both." He paused, uncertainty flickering in his eyes before finally giving a reluctant nod. As I reclined on one side of the bed, my gaze fixated on the ceiling above. Mason reclined next to me, his breath a gentle whisper in the stillness. I endeavored to persuade myself that it was acceptable for nothing to unfold. Yet, beneath the surface, I was aware of the truth. On that night, a palpable shift began to envelop the atmosphere. The atmosphere in the room transformed into a serene stillness, while the distant chirping of crickets filled the night air. The gentle glow of the lamp painted shadows across the walls, weaving a tapestry of a dreamlike ambience. Mason occupied one side of the bed, his eyes glued to his phone, while I feigned interest in the pages of a book. Yet my thoughts were elsewhere. The dinner table was enveloped in silence, much like the majority of our shared meals. David regaled us with tales of work, his words flowing as Mason and I listened intently, nodding in agreement. Neither of us truly existed in the moment. The exact moment the tension began eludes me, yet perhaps it has lingered all along, a subtle undercurrent I chose to overlook for years. "It has become quite evident that you aren't truly engaging with that, are you?" Suddenly, Mason's voice pierced through the stillness. "What leads you to that conclusion?" I inquired, attempting to maintain a nonchalant demeanor. He wore a sly grin as he placed his phone on the table. "You've remained on that same page for the past 20 minutes. I chuckled quietly, a flush of embarrassment creeping over me. "You have successfully captured my attention." Mason shifted, and there was an ease in his body language that struck me as unusual. "What thoughts occupy your mind?" The question caught me off guard. "Nothing," I uttered with haste. He arched an eyebrow, a clear sign of his skepticism. "Let's go, Evelyn. I understand you more deeply than that." The manner in which he uttered my name sent a thrill through my heart, causing it to momentarily falter. It was not the typical stepmother or the absence of sound. It felt different. I let out a sigh, reclining against the headboard. I find myself reflecting on how things once were. Family trips were once a source of joy, weren't they? Mason inclined his head, a gentle warmth spreading across his features. Indeed, those were the days when it was just my father and me, before the veil was lifted and I came to understand the artifice that surrounded us. His words struck with intensity, yet not due to any fault in their truth. "I have made an effort," I murmured, "to bring this to fruition, to become a person whom both you and your father could rely upon." "I understand," he said softly, "and I truly appreciate it, even if I don't always express it." At that moment, it seemed as though the barriers that had long separated us were finally beginning to crumble. We engaged in a lengthy conversation, expressing our frustrations regarding David and reminiscing about the journeys Mason had shared with his mother. "She was the adhesive that held everything together," Mason remarked, his voice tinged with a wistful longing. "Father was perpetually engaged in his labor, yet it was Mother who infused our lives with a sense of wholeness." I inclined my head, a weight settling in my chest. Meeting the expectations of someone like that is a formidable challenge. "There's no obligation," he stated plainly. A serene hush enveloped us, wrapping around our thoughts like a soft blanket. I extinguished the lamp, allowing the moonlight to cascade into the room. My leg grazed his. Apologies escaped my lips as I instinctively withdrew. "It's fine," he said, his voice a soft murmur, steady and composed. Yet, there was something uniquely distinct about that moment. Each subtle movement seemed amplified, a reminder of how emotionally charged the moment was. "Are you doing all right?" Mason inquired gently, shattering the stillness. I paused, my throat parched. "I'm well, or so I claimed." "I don't believe you are," he murmured, his tone gentler now. Before I could respond, he stepped closer, his presence suddenly more noticeable. I stood still, caught in a moment of disbelief. "Mason," I murmured, "have you ever sensed that you're merely playing a role?" He inquired abruptly, his voice edged with emotion. "Existence in a reality that doesn't truly belong to you? Following all the rules, yet still feeling like an imposter?" His words resonated profoundly within me. Each day, I acknowledged the words lingered in the space between us, unrefined and sincere. And then it unfolded. It unfolded without any flair or forethought. In one fleeting moment, we shared a quiet understanding that neither of us voiced aloud. As his hand grazed against mine, an unspoken agreement lingered in the air, and neither of us chose to retreat. "Is this acceptable?" he murmured softly. I ought to have declined. I ought to have risen and departed from the room. Yet I found myself facing him instead. My heart races with fervor. "Indeed," I murmured once it had concluded. We reclined in quietude. A tempest of confusion and guilt swirled within me, yet words eluded my lips. "I'm sorry," Mason said, his voice shattering the silence. "There's no need for apologies," I responded swiftly, my voice quivering. "It's perfectly acceptable." He confessed, "I have no idea what this means." "Neither do I," I murmured, yet within the depths of my being, I understood its significance. As dawn broke, I found myself awake before Mason, carefully extricating myself from the warmth of the bed with the utmost stealth. The gentle light of dawn seeped through the curtains, enveloping the room in a warm golden glow. I hurriedly donned my clothes, steering clear of the mirror's gaze, and by the moment Mason began to awaken, I found myself perched by the window, feigning deep interest in the majestic mountains beyond. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice heavy with the remnants of slumber. "Good morning," I responded, maintaining a neutral tone for just a moment. He paused, a flicker of unspoken thoughts crossing his mind, yet he merely nodded and stepped into the bathroom, silence enveloping him once more. As we encountered David in the dining room for breakfast, the air crackled with the unmistakable tension between Mason and me. David, lost in his own world, savored his coffee while perusing the newspaper, casually remarking on the weather and our day's agenda. Yet, I could sense Mason's intense gaze upon me, probing and weighty, and it required every ounce of my resolve to avoid his eyes. I reassured myself that the tension would dissipate, that the recollection of the previous night would blur, and we would revert to our usual selves. Yet, as the hours passed, I started to grasp the unsettling truth. Some actions, once taken, are irrevocable. The journey back from the lodge unfolded in silence. The silence was not the tranquil stillness I had envisioned. Instead, it bore an unsettling heaviness, as if every unvoiced sentiment and contemplation was closing in around us. David remained blissfully unaware, humming softly and tapping his fingers rhythmically on the steering wheel while he maneuvered through the serpentine mountain roads. Mason occupied the back seat, his gaze fixed on the world outside, while I maintained my focus ahead, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. I endeavored to immerse myself in the landscape beyond. The undulating hills, the dense forests, the warm glow of sunlight streaming through the leaves, but my mind persistently returned to the events of the night before. Every detail was etched into my memory. Mason's breathing, the fleeting touch of his hand against mine felt otherworldly, as if plucked from the fabric of a dream, yet the weight of the ensuing consequences loomed unmistakably in the air. I dared to steal a look at Mason through the rearview mirror. He appeared serene, bordering on apathy, yet I could detect the strain in his jaw and the way his fingers clutched the armrest with an intensity that suggested otherwise. As we finally rolled into the driveway, we both averted our eyes, leaving me to wonder whether this shared silence was a relief or a form of punishment. David extended his limbs, his mind already weaving intricate plans for the hours ahead. "I've got a meeting in a couple of hours," he declared, "but we ought to plan something for tonight, perhaps dinner at that new inn place." Of course, I responded instinctively, yet the mere idea of a family dinner twisted my stomach in knots. Mason remained silent. He took hold of his bag from the trunk and entered the house in silence. The remainder of the afternoon unfolded in a series of chores. I meticulously folded the laundry, scrubbed the kitchen until it gleamed, and rearranged the bookshelf in the living room, seeking any task to occupy my mind. Yet, despite my efforts, my thoughts relentlessly returned to Mason. I revisited our dialogue from the previous night, recalling how he expressed his sense of disorientation in pretending to be someone he truly wasn't. I recalled the silent comprehension reflected in his gaze, a sentiment I hadn't experienced from anyone in years, especially not from David. The echo of footsteps ascending the stairs broke the silence of my contemplation. "What holds us back?" he insisted. "For reasons of morality, practicality, or fear. Cease this at once." I turned away from him, frustration bubbling within me. He edged nearer, his voice now a gentle whisper. "There's no need for you to maintain the facade any longer, Evelyn." "Not with me. Please, Mason," I whispered, feeling a tightness in my chest for a fleeting moment. I shook my head, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. "This isn't fair to any of us," he repeated, his voice trembling with emotion. Your words were something I longed to hear." In that fleeting moment, silence enveloped us both. He rose to his feet, his fingers combing through his hair. "I'm going to go for a walk," he murmured, his voice barely rising above a whisper. "Exercise caution," I murmured, yet the utterance seemed devoid of substance. He nodded, and in an instant he vanished, leaving me alone with my reflections. That night, I found myself wide awake, my gaze fixed on the ceiling while David slumbered peacefully beside me. I sensed a suffocating confinement, a self-imposed prison that had ensnared me, leaving no avenue for escape. The following morning, Mason had vanished. Upon the kitchen counter, I discovered a note scrawled in his untidy script. "I require a moment to gather my thoughts. No need to concern yourself with my well-being. I assure you I will manage just fine. I simply must navigate this journey independently." The words struck me with the force of a gut-wrenching blow. I grasped the note tightly, my fingers quaking as a wave of panic surged within me. "What is that?" David inquired, entering the kitchen with his phone clutched in his hand. "Mason has gone," I uttered, my voice trembling. David's brow furrowed as he accepted the note from my hand. "What on earth does that signify? Where has he wandered off to?" "I don't know," I confessed, my eyes brimming with tears. With a weary sigh, David raked his fingers through his hair. "The lad rarely contemplates his actions. He's likely brooding in some corner. He will return when hunger calls to him." His condescending tone ignited a fire within me. "This is not sulking, David. He is evidently distressed. What do you anticipate I can do regarding this situation?" He retorted sharply. "He has reached adulthood. If he chooses to behave like a child, that is his concern to bear." I gazed at him, taken aback by his utter lack of concern. "It seems that you are indifferent, aren't you?" "Certainly, I care," he declared, yet the inflection of his voice betrayed a different sentiment. "However, I shall not pursue him. He must mature and confront his own challenges." I averted my gaze, striving to calm my breath, the burden of it all pressing heavily upon me. The subsequent days dragged on in torment. Every moment was consumed by thoughts of Mason, where he might be, whether he was safe, and if he would return to me. I attempted to reach him, but his phone went directly to voicemail. I contemplated the idea of driving around in search of him, yet I found myself at a loss for where to begin. David appeared indifferent. He continued with his affairs as if nothing had shifted, allowing me to bear the burden of my anxiety in solitude. One evening, while I lingered in the living room, my gaze fixed on my phone, I received a call from my friend Emily. "It's been some time since I last heard from you," she remarked. Her voice resonated with worry. "Is all well?" For a brief instant, I found myself pausing. In a moment of uncertainty, I replied, "The situation is intricate." "At long last, intricate," she insisted. I swept my fingers through my hair, releasing a deep sigh. Mason departed. He remained silent about his destination and the timing of his return. "Has something occurred?" she inquired. Her tone was incisive. Once more, I found myself hesitating, the burden of the truth bearing down upon me. "It has been rather tense of late," I admitted, skirting around the complete reality. "Aha," Emily remarked, her skepticism evident. "If you ever feel the need for a conversation, you know where to reach me." "Thank you." I spoke softly, though uncertainty lingered in my heart. Once the call ended, I lingered in silence, my gaze fixed on the vacant spot that Mason had occupied. The house seemed to echo with an emptiness in his absence, and I caught myself revisiting our final conversation time and again. I pondered the way he had gazed at me, the unfiltered vulnerability reflected in his eyes. I pondered his question, the one I had struggled to respond to with sincerity. "Did it merely seem like a mistake to you?" I was unaware. Perhaps it was. Perhaps it was something deeper, a truth I wasn't prepared to confront. What I understood was a profound sense of longing for him, a realization that filled me with a fear deeper than any other. Mason's absence left a noticeable change in the energy of the home. As days morphed into weeks, the stillness within the house deepened, weighing down on every fleeting moment. David continued as though all was well, immersing himself in his tasks and waving away any reference to Mason with a casual flick of his hand. "He'll be fine," David reiterated time and again, as he always does. Yet, I found myself far from fine, and uncertainty loomed over whether Mason was in the same state. Some afternoons, I found myself driving without purpose, yearning and wishing for the chance to spot him strolling down a street or seated in a cafe. I scoured his social media with relentless fervor, yet there was no trace of him to be found. He seemed to vanish without a trace. A lingering sense of guilt washed over me, as if his departure was somehow a reflection of my own shortcomings. The note he left was brief, carrying an air of nonchalance. Yet the timing seemed far too precise to be mere chance. "I wish for you to remain oblivious to these words. Yet, should you choose to do so, I trust it will aid in your understanding. Thoughts of you linger in my mind, reflections on us, and the memories of that night haunt me. I understand it was a mistake, and I realize it likely held no significance for you. Yet, for me, it held immense significance. You make me feel acknowledged, as though I am not merely a failure or a source of disappointment. Your presence instills in me a sense of significance, leaving me uncertain about how to navigate this newfound feeling. I've made attempts to release it, yet it clings to me, and perhaps that's the very reason I must depart. I apologize if my actions have complicated your situation. It was never my intention, yet I find myself unable to remain here any longer. This isn't the way. Look after your well-being. Evelyn and Mason." The letter was read thrice, and with each reading, its weight settled more profoundly within me. My hands trembled as I placed it down. My thoughts surged, a whirlwind of emotions I struggled to decipher. His departure was a consequence of my actions, due to the events that transpired, the manner in which I had addressed it, or rather how I had failed to manage it. Relief should have washed over me at his departure, taking with him the temptation and the peril that accompanied it. Yet what enveloped me was a profound, gnawing void, a force that loomed, ready to engulf me entirely. David returned home in the late hours of the night. His tie hung askew, the scent of whiskey lingering on his garments. He set his briefcase down by the door and made his way to the kitchen, silently pouring himself another drink. I trailed behind him, the letter gripped tightly in my hand. "David," I started, my voice quivering. He turned, his weary gaze meeting mine. "What is it, Evelyn?" "I must speak with you," I declared, my fingers clenching the letter with urgency. With a heavy sigh, he placed his glass on the table. "Is it possible to postpone this? The day has stretched on, seemingly endless." I astonished myself with my resolute declaration. "No, it cannot wait." His brow furrowed in discontent. He stands with his arms crossed over his chest, a posture that speaks volumes. What holds such significance? There was a moment of uncertainty. The words lodged themselves in my throat. I found myself unable to share the entirety of my thoughts with him. Not at this moment. In place of words, I offered him the letter. "What is this?" he inquired, as he took it from my grasp. "Simply read it," I murmured. As he opened the letter, his gaze moved over the carefully penned words. His expression shifted from bewilderment to fury, and then to a shadowy intensity. "What on earth is this?" he insisted, his tone dark and menacing. "It's from Mason," I murmured. "No kidding," he snapped, brandishing the letter with a fierce intensity. What on earth could he possibly mean by this? What transpired? "Evelyn." I sensed the heavy burden of his fury, his incredulity enveloping me. "David, what actions have you taken?" he bellowed, his voice reverberating through the kitchen. "I never intended for this to occur," I murmured, my tears streaming down my cheeks. "It was an error. A mistake," he repeated, his voice laced with venom. "Is that what you consider a mistake?" I found myself unable to reply. The burden of his fury felt insurmountable. That night, David departed, the door crashing shut behind him, its reverberation lingering in the stillness of the house. For hours, I found myself on the kitchen floor, fixated on the letter that lay crumpled in my grasp. A tempest of emotions surged within me, a desperate urge to scream, to weep, to flee and never glance back. Yet my body remained paralyzed, rooted in place. The following morning, I compelled myself to rise from bed. The silence in the house was almost palpable. The void left by David and Mason enveloped the room in a palpable heaviness. Escape was not an option for me.